Hello, everyone, and welcome to what would be a rather quick intro to promises in JavaScript. Now, this video is really aimed at folks who are not very familiar with modern JavaScript development techniques and syntaxes. So I'm going to stick to the really old school JavaScript syntaxes, and I'm not going to use anything crazy like arrow functions or anything of that sort. And I know that this is a topic that has been covered extensively by a lot of other people out there. You can find tons of documentation and videos on this topic out. And my hope is that this video at least helps a few people get an introduction into what promises in JavaScript can do and inspires you guys to follow up with more material and adopt promises in your development lifecycle. Because it honestly kind of annoys me a little bit when I see developers still using old school JavaScript callback functions when they could be easily using promises or async await. So that being said, let's get into it. So before we talk about promises, we always have to talk about why we need promises, and so that naturally brings us to callback functions and the side effect of callback functions, which is callback hell. So JavaScript, as you guys know, is single-threaded really, and but it supports asynchronous functions. And what that means is that you can call an asynchronous function in JavaScript, and it will return immediately from the function, but the main purpose of the function has not been served yet. So, and that is usually because you want the asynchronous function to execute um, a piece of code after a certain interval, or the asynchronous function is making a call to get a resource across the network, and it has to wait for that resource to be fetched before it can go ahead and do something with the response. And in both these cases, it is counterproductive for us to wait for the function to finish execution before we move ahead. So what we essentially do is we call the asynchronous function, we pass in a callback function as an argument to the asynchronous function. What the asynchronous function in turn does is that once it has finished execution of the main relevant part, it calls that callback function, and that's how we know, okay, this asynchronous function has finished whatever it's supposed to do. Um, and let's take an example. Actually, let's look at how callback functions look like in JavaScript. So this is a very simple function that I have. All it does is it takes two parameters, an interval and a callback function. The interval is really an integer or a long value, and what it does is it calls the set timeout function, JavaScript's set timeout function, with this interval, and within the function it just logs a console.log, and it invokes the callback function after that. Now, let's say I have to invoke this function, asynchronous function, back to back 4 times with different values for the intervals, and measure how much time it takes. So this is how I would do it. I'm calling the function first with a value of 1 second, followed by a callback function. And inside that callback function, I'm calling the same function again, but with a different interval, again with a different callback function, and this goes on. So as you can see, this is a rather simple example, um, but even then you can see how quickly, these nested callbacks can get out of hand. And for a complex function, it can get out of hand really quickly. I mean, I'm not gonna. Well, I guess I can go ahead and run this and show you guys that it actually works and does what I'm claiming it does. So if I were to call this, you can see that it's calling the function with callback back to back, and the total function execution time is like around 10 seconds, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. So it does what it's supposed to, and but it can the code is not very elegant. It can get really difficult to read and maintain. So then that brings us to promises. So let me start by quickly defining a promise function so that I can show you guys how this is different from the other variant of implementing this function using callbacks. So the first difference that you guys can see is that it only takes a single argument. There's no callback function. And what I'm going to do in this function is return a promise. This promise function, the promise is constructed basically by using the new promise constructor, which in turn takes a single argument. This argument is a function. But this function, again, in turn, takes two arguments, resolve and reject. And resolve and reject is just the standard convention that's followed in JavaScript for the arguments given to the promise function. And these are in turn functions themselves. Resolve is a function, reject is a function. And within the promise, the body of the function that I'm passing as a parameter to the promise constructor, I am going to implement my main method or main logic for the asynchronous function, which is called set timeout with the interval. And within that function, I am going to perform whatever my main logic is. And following which, I'm going to call the resolve function. So this is what gives control back to the caller, like the resolve function. It tells you that whatever you wanted to execute in the promise executed successfully. I'm going to wrap this in a try-catch block, and inside the catch block, I'm going to call the reject function with the error object, and that's how you handle errors within a promise. So, so for this simple example, it might look a little intimidating at first to you guys, but the benefits will be clear pretty soon when I show you how I would go about calling the promise function back to back, as I did in the previous example. So I'm just calling the promise function first with an argument of 1,000. So it's going to execute this after a second. And then on the promise that is returned, I'm calling the then function, which is a property of promises. And inside the then, I'm going to pass a function which essentially acts as the resolve function that you see here. And inside that function, I'm going to return another instance of this, or I'm just going to call this promise, and which is going to return another instance of this, the same kind of promise that I'm returning here. And you can see here that inside the then function, I am not directly calling this promise. I am defining a function. I'm passing a function as a parameter, and this function, when it is invoked, will return the promise. So this is something that you have to keep in mind. It might be a little difficult to wrap your head around at the beginning, but it's not that difficult to understand once you practice it a little bit. So again, I'm going to repeat: you just pass in a function that returns your actual promise within the resolve method. So I'm just going to call this once more and call it with a 4-second interval here. And then finally, I'm going to execute the all done method. And this should take roughly 10 seconds like it did previously. So we have to define T1 here. Another advantage of using promises is that you can have a single catch block at the end, which basically takes in a function that receives the error object, and then you can do whatever you want with it. And that's all there is to using promises, guys. It's quite simple, and I can show you the execution here. As you can see, it is executing as it is supposed to, and in a total of 10 seconds, it finishes execution, and we're done.